So we're going to finish out the afternoon with a couple of talks on the repro front, the first of which will be from Tony Bruinje, a short presentation from a piece of his PhD work that, speaking of survivors, he did with me. So Tony is now a doctor and stayed on for a postdoc, which he's working on right now, but this is some of the work that he did during his PhD.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Talk a little, as Steven said, so this is a piece of my PhD, which, there. Okay, I won't move. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking a little bit of some postpartum health and how it associates with pregnancy losses, which is one of the pieces of my PhD, as I was saying. So the transition cow, as we know, she transitions from a period where she's pregnant, non-lactating, obviously. She undergoes a whole parturition process, and then after that, she starts producing increasingly and continuously amounts of milk. And that can be, as we can assume, it can be really dramatic in terms of like physiological and biological changes that can happen in this period. So some of the things that we know that happens in these cows, and here I'm not talking about clinical disease or something that you can see, but what we know they're undergoing in most cows is that they have a depression in their immune system that starts a couple of weeks before calving. It kind of peaks around time of calving, as far as we know, as we understand. The majority of cows, older cows, they have a drop in blood calcium. They also undergo a period of systemic inflammation because of the parturition process and other changes related to dietary changes and so on. And then cows also undergo a period of negative energy balance, or we usually see that by increase in blood markers such as increase in blood BHB or ketone bodies. And something we don't talk about enough, unless you hang out with Steven, then you probably heard a lot about that, is that an important amount of cows, at least a quarter of cows, even though they don't show any clinical signs, they still have an indication of uterine inflammation weeks after calving. So all of these things are gone. We still see some cows with like an inflammation that is not associated with clinical signs. And of course, these are all risk factors for clinical disease, as I'm going to talk a little bit more about, but they all can be risk factors as well for decreased fertility, which I'm going to focus today, but also problems decreasing productivity, issues with animal welfare, as well as profitability in general, overall. So it's not surprising that cows are at high risk of having health disorders, and we actually see in many different data sets from different places, we always see that about 40 to 55% of cows, they have at least one clinical disease during these first couple of weeks postpartum. And one of the big problems or big carryover effects of this disease is on the breeding period or when we are trying to get these cows pregnant. So a couple of weeks later, we have the breeding period. So in terms of reproductive systems, what we want the cows to do is to resume their estrous cyclicity. So they have their first ovulation postpartum and they start to naturally cycle. So then during the breeding period, these cows, they're either going to be detected in heat visually or by activity monitors, or they're going to respond to timed AI protocols. And once they're finally bred, we expect these cows to become pregnant, hopefully majority of them in the first try, in the first insemination. But what the literature has shown consistently is that when cows have a clinical disease, they are less likely to do all of these things. So they are less likely to resume cyclicity early, they're less likely to be detected in heat, less likely to respond to protocols, especially if they're not cyclic, of course, and less likely to become pregnant. So when I talk about become pregnant, it's usually by the way that we are used to measure pregnancy, where we usually expect the herd veterinarian to go around 30 days after insemination and check, is there an embryo here or not? So when we breed a cow, of course, if a fertilization occurs successfully, we have an embryo that is developing, and around 30 days, we have an embryo that the herd veterinarian can see with an ultrasound. And what is common to do is, in many herds, the herd veterinarian is going to go twice. So at 30 days, and then there is a reconfirmation of pregnancy, let's say 30 days later. And the reason we do this is because there is a proportion of cows here that actually lose the pregnancy, which is kind of expected. So for example, if the herd veterinarian here, Lucio, if Lucio checks a cow or checks all the cows in his herd list at the day and 45% of them are pregnant, we usually expect that around 10 to 15% of those cows are going to lose that pregnancy. And then some of them, or 10 to 15% of the pregnant ones, are not going to be pregnant. However, when we check the open cows, so all the 55% of cows that Lucio said were open, he usually assumes that those cows just never got pregnant, so there's not a fertilization here. But we think that there's actually a lot of cows that maybe there was a fertilization happening, but they actually lost at the very early stages. And there is a little bit of data, some data showing that, but it's a little bit limited because it's not very easy to find an embryo here to get a good number of cows and to find, okay, how many cows are actually pregnant here. And that's kind of what we wanted to look at this study. So we wanted to understand if postpartum diseases, as I talked before, they can contribute to early losses even before the first pregnancy diagnosis. So to do that, we went to 2 commercial herds here in Ontario. We enrolled 468 cows for this study, and each herd had about 450 cows. So we started with these cows before calving, and then we tried to measure as many health variables and clinical disease variables that we thought was relevant. So we took many blood samples, we did a bunch of examinations, and we looked at the vaginal discharge of these cows for uterine disease. And just as a summary of what we are looking here, we wanted to see hypocalcemia, inflammation, fat mobilization, ketosis, and some clinical disease markers like retained placenta, metritis, based on a fatty vaginal discharge in the first 2 weeks. And then after the first 2 weeks, we looked at endometritis. So endometritis, we actually took a sample from the uterus to see if there was inflammatory cells there, to see if there is an inflammation in the uterus. We looked whether cows had a purulent vaginal discharge, which can or cannot be associated with that uterine inflammation. Also onset of cyclicity, body condition score loss, and lameness, and also other clinical diseases that were recorded by the farm. So, but how could we tell if the cows were actually pregnant before we can do the diagnosis? So at about 19 days after insemination, the early embryo actually secretes a protein called interferon tau that, although this protein, we cannot measure it in circulation, we can measure it indirectly. So the white blood cells in blood, they actually sense this protein, this marker, and it changes the profile, or it actually enhances the expression of a gene that we call interferon-stimulated genes. So then what we do, we simply do is take a blood sample and we isolate the blood leukocytes or the white blood cells, and we do a gene expression to see if those genes related to this interferon were highly expressed or not. And then we have an indication was there an embryo at that early stage or not. So that's what we did. So we looked whether cows were pregnant at day 19, and then as well as later on at day 29, also 33 and 40. And those were done based on a validated and consistently used marker of pregnancy, which is a pregnancy-associated glycoprotein in circulation. So this is just a summary of the prevalence or incidence of disease that we found. So we found that 58% of cows in this population, they were clinically healthy, there was no clinical disease, and then 8% of them had RP or retained placenta, 14% had metritis, 19% had a PVD, and that's purulent vaginal discharge at week 5, 23% endometritis, and 37% had at least one of these uterine-related disease, and 17% had lameness. When you look at our pregnancy per AI or pregnancy outcomes data for each time point, we were quite surprised to see that the healthy cows, actually 71% of them were considered pregnant at day 19 based on the ICG expression. And the ones that had a uterine disease had a significantly lower proportion of pregnant cows in each time point, so 54%. And then naturally that proportion of cows went down over time, but at the end we had 49% of healthy cows pregnant, only 31% of cows with a uterine disease pregnant. And as I said before, by uterine disease, I mean any of retained placenta, metritis, PVD, or endometritis based on cytology. And we evaluated this as well as all the other variables that I showed before in multivariable analysis to try to account for everything that we could. And the variable that stood out was metritis for pregnancy losses. So, for example, we found that healthy cows in this subpopulation, compared to the ones with metritis, 67% of them were pregnant at day 19, and 22% of these healthy cows lost the pregnancy by day 29, when we are usually able to do a preg check with the ultrasound. But the ones with metritis, that proportion was actually 43%, which was quite high. And when you look at the entire period, so from day 19 to 40, 34% of the healthy cows had a pregnancy loss, which was high, but compared to the ones that had metritis, that was 70% of the cows. Of the pregnant cows with metritis here, lost that pregnancy by day 40. So only 19% of the cows that had metritis were pregnant at day 40. So in conclusion, we found that uterine disease possibly, very likely have a minimum effect on fertility, especially when you talk about this early pregnancy establishment and pregnancy losses. And specifically metritis, cows with metritis were 4 to 5 times more likely to lose the pregnancy by day 40. And cows with endometritis at week 5, we measured at 35 days in milk, they were 2 to 3 times less likely to conceive and to have an embryo at day 19. And I talk about endometritis, but here I have a picture of PVD because endometritis is probably not something that is practical to confirm with a cytology at a farm, but PVD is something that is fairly easy to check in cows and be part of a herd health program, and has a high correlation with endometritis. And I guess the take-home message here, we didn't investigate any treatment or any way to try to how to solve that problem, but it's very likely that if we can detect these diseases early and accurately and treat them as soon as we detect them, we can possibly mitigate those effects, negative effects on fertility, at least as best as we can. And for those who are interested and want to know more or see a little bit of more numbers, we have published this data, which has been out in the Journal of Dairy Science a couple of weeks ago, so you can go and check it out. It's open access. And for this project, I would like to thank the funders, the DFO, OMAFRA, and CERC, and the dairy farmers that we let us work with their cows, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Tony, questions for Tony? Your brains are getting full, eh? You're saturated. You're like in the same office with him. You have to come here to us. Okay, go.
You might not have the answer. Just wondering. So why still you have cows that have metritis and they get pregnant? What do you think that happens?
Like cows have metritis and still get pregnant?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that like having metritis will completely damage their uterus or their uterine glands, but I think that it may happen. So this deteriorating effect of metritis on the uterus may happen in many of the cows that have metritis, but maybe not so much in others. And I think that the severity of metritis may vary between cows as well, which is something that is very hard to compare. Yeah.
It's like there is no like a standardization of how serious metritis is, just metritis and then.
In this study, yes. I think it'll be interesting to kind of try to do, more like classifications, but I think, there's not a lot of data on that, but I think that's something that'll be interesting. Like metritis that have just clinical signs from the uterus or from the vaginal discharge standpoint, or case of metritis where you have systemic signs, fever, and so on. There are probably some differences there.
One of the practical take-homes too is that Tony and the team were checking these cows for metritis twice a week for the first 2 weeks, and we're finding cows that I think it's fair to say the farms would not have been finding or treating by themselves, or certainly finding them earlier and probably finding some that they wouldn't have found without proactively looking. So there's a sweet spot between over-treating metritis, because the treatment is systemic antibiotics, but on the other side, making sure we treat enough, because not all of these cows were necessarily treated in this particular study.
Yeah, yeah. True.
And I'll put in one more shameless plug. There's a poster around the corner from Anand's postdoc, which was actually done on the same farms, but in a separate study, looking at a non-antibiotic treatment of metritis, which looks really promising. So we're keen on that. Thanks, Tony.
Yep, thank you.